Hello everyone, welcome back to the Clara CFO Group channel. Today I wanted to tell you guys about a new SBA form. Now, before anybody gets too concerned, I want to tell you that this form is specifically for borrowers who have loans over $2 million. Okay, so I know a lot of you won't even have to worry about that, but if you're kind of curious about what those $2 million borrowers are going to have to go through to get their loans forgiven, you might want to just go ahead and listen up because this is kind of interesting. Now, if you remember that there was times that when the PPP first came out and people applied for funds, there were a lot of businesses that got money over $2 million that maybe shouldn't have. There were ones that were publicly traded and people that had access to a lot of liquidity, and yet, which basically means cash, right? That they had access to other funds, but they took the PPP money because it was like, hey, free money, you know? And that was gonna leave less money for the borrowers that really needed it. So there was this option of safe harbor for people to return the loans, to return them without any penalty if they maybe got the funds and then they realized that they didn't really meet the requirements of really needing the money. So, and then the SBA came out and said, hey, just so you guys know, anybody who gets a loan over $2 million is also going to be audited. Every single loan, not like spot audits, like everyone is going to be looked at. So because of that, a lot of people with loans over $2 million ended up returning them because they either couldn't prove out their need for the loan, or they just didn't want to deal with the scrutiny of an audit, okay? So now it's coming time that these companies are now applying for their PPP forgiveness, and a new form was just put out by the SBA. So I want to tell you guys about that real quick. If this is interesting to you, if it's helpful and you want to keep up on all the latest news on the PPP, please go ahead and subscribe to the channel and put the little, click the little bell, because that will let you know as soon as there's a new video. So as soon as I heard about this form, I said I have to do a video on it because it was kind of a new thing and I know a lot of people didn't know about it. So I wanted to make sure we get a video out on this. Now, the number of this is the 3509 form. All the forgiveness applications are 3508. So this is the 09 form for for-profit entities, and then the 3510 for nonprofit entities. But for both of the 3509 and 10, these are for borrowers who have loans over $2 million. So you don't need to worry about any of these questions if you have a loan under $2 million. But it's pretty fascinating, so you might want to stay tuned. Okay, so we can tell from this form that the two things the SBA is really concerned about is business activity. What was the level of business activity during the covered period, and then liquidity needs, okay? And liquidity, remember, is really just about cash needs. Did the company really need the money? Okay, so we're gonna go through and just kind of do a high level of the types of questions that they're asking for. So regarding business activity, one of the very first questions that's asked on this form is comparing Q2 2020 revenue to Q2 2019. That's a really good indicator, because let's say that it dipped from $50 million in Q2 of last year, which would be a little high, but $50 million in Q2 last year to $25 or $20 million in Q2 of this year. So if that's an indicator, that would be great. Now, I would say that all of these questions are just yes or no questions. They're not necessarily like, oh, you get that question wrong and you're going to have to pay back your PPP loan. It's more just they're asking these questions and they're gathering information, and you need to answer these questions correctly, because the certification at the end of this is not joking around. You need to apply and answer all of these questions truthfully. But just because you answer something that maybe sounds negative doesn't necessarily mean that your PPP loan is going to get kicked out, okay? Kicked out and not be able to be forgiven. So then the next one was your business affected? Because remember, we're talking about business activity. Was your business affected, and did it have a shutdown? And if it was shut down, who shut it down, and what is the start and end dates of the shutdown order? The next would be, was there an alteration of operations because of an outside force? Very similar questions. Who did it, start and end dates, that type of stuff. Then the next set of questions ask if there was a voluntary shutdown, because some people chose to close down their businesses even though technically they didn't have the outside forces telling them they had to. That might have been because their employees weren't comfortable, or because of, really the type of business that they were doing, they just weren't having enough demand. So they had to shut down operations. That would be a voluntary. And if that was the case, you need to document that here in this question. And then additionally to that, if you voluntarily altered the type of work you were doing, or you voluntarily altered the level of work you were doing, you would also list that. And you can also list the cost associated with any alterations of those operations. They also want to know whether or not any new capital projects were undertaken during the time. So hopefully you weren't building buildings or doing anything crazy with your PPP money, because you're going to have to answer to this question right here. So were there any new capital projects? What was the cash outlay for those projects? And then you do have an option to describe the situation. You do need to include your NAICS code, and then really it gives you space for any additional comments. So this is an area where you might be able to explain out if maybe something doesn't look all that good for you. You might be able to explain out exactly why something happened, or why maybe you spent money on a capital project when you weren't really planning to, or whatever. This is a good place to add in some additional flavor to that. The next set of questions really goes around liquidity assessments and whether or not you had enough cash to cover the operations during this time. So the first is to just list any cash and cash equivalents you had as of the last day of the last quarter before you got the loan. So if your quarter ended March 31st and you got the loan May 1st, you would list your cash and cash equivalents as of March 31st. Were any dividends or capital distributions paid out to owners other than those for taxes? If so, how much? Remember, we are trying to avoid owner windfalls with this money. They're trying to keep people honest. Were any debts prepaid? They would like to know that. And were any employees that had compensation, were there any employees that had compensation over $250,000 on an annualized basis? And if so, you need to list those, or at least the total of all the compensation paid to those employees. And the same question, but for owners. Were any owners paid more than $250,000 on an annualized basis? Was the borrower's equity available on any stock exchange? So if you're a C Corp and you're selling your stock somewhere, or you're publicly traded in any way, shape, or form, you need to include that. And if you do, they want to know what your market cap is, or your market capitalization, so they can understand the valuation and the size of your company. On the date of the loan application, did a public company own 20% or more of the company's equity? So maybe your company who got the loan is not publicly traded, but it's majority owned or over 20% owned by a publicly traded company. They would like to know that. And let's see, what was the shareholders' equity value of the company as of the last day of the calendar quarter before the loan was received? They also want to know if the borrower is a subsidiary of a larger company. So maybe it's not 20% owned by a public company, but they want to just know, hey, is this owned by some cash cow like somewhere else in the US? They want to know who the parent company is. What is it, a US company or is it foreign owned? And then if that company is publicly traded, what is their market cap? And then they also want to know if over 20% is owned by a VC firm, venture capital, a hedge fund, or any other kind of private equity. And then they also want to know if there is an affiliate or a subsidiary, if the company is an affiliate or a subsidiary of a foreign owned entity. They would like to know. And if you are, then you need to name it. We can't just say yes and then not disclose who it is. So did the borrower receive any other CARES Act funding? So anything that was related to the CARES Act, if your business received anything, I know there were some industry specific funds specifically listed in the CARES Act. If you got anything like that, you want to list that in this application or in this questionnaire. And then there's just a place to describe any additional notes here. So make sure that you are describing, if anything is kind of looking not all that great for you, make sure you take advantage of that additional comments section to make sure you explain why something happened. And if you feel like there's any other maybe things that aren't covered in the questionnaire, but are also like key factors in why you feel like you needed the PPP loan, it would be a fine time to go ahead and put that in the comments. So I hope that is helpful for you. That is the explanation of the 3509 form. I imagine the 3510 is basically the same, but I didn't go into the 3510. I just think those are probably fewer and further between. So we did not go over that one, but essentially assessing the business activity and the liquidity assessment, these two things are apparently very important to the SBA, which we kind of knew they would be, right? So remember, if you have a loan under $2 million, you do not need to worry about any of these questions. So don't even concern yourself with it. But if you do know anyone who has a loan over $2 million, you might want to make sure they know that this is a real thing and they're going to have to fill out all these questions. If this video is helpful to you, please go ahead and give it a thumbs up. I really appreciate it. And please do share this with anybody you may know that has a loan over $2 million. Thank you so much.